Hi everyone, welcome to Littlefish's CXO Insight Talk. It's not if, it's when. 3 steps to take and 3 steps to avoid when building cyber defences. My name's Rowan. I'm a senior cybersecurity consultant at Littlefish, and I've been in the industry for over 15 years, working from managing a data centre and a support desk team all the way up to auditing for ISO 27001 and PCI DSS. I want to thank you for coming. And I know it's been probably a long day if you've been watching all the talks, but really appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll share something with you that's useful, and I'll give you some insight into some of my experiences working with clients across the board. So let's dive right in. So this moniker of it's not if, it's when is becoming a standard term I think we're seeing in the industry. And I think people are starting to realise that everyone is a potential attack target, and the attitude of they'll never get me or it won't be me is starting to dwindle away. So let's have a look at some of the points that I think when we're starting to think about cyber defences, whether we're building from the ground up or whether we're looking to mature as well, these points I feel people need to consider before they make the decision to go down these routes. But I think these particular ideas are something I've seen a number of times where companies have made a decision and it hasn't been the most efficient from a spend point of view, but also hasn't been the most efficient from a defences point of view. So let's have a look at those now. So we've got the charge of the Purple Light Brigade, solutions for solutions' sake. And what I mean by this is people buying solutions to try and solve their problems, and essentially that solution doesn't actually do much. It becomes a bit of a paperweight and it's not really an efficient spend for that organisation, but they may have seen it somewhere. They may have been to a show or seen a demonstration and been sold by the sales and marketing team of these vendors. So we need to really be careful when we're picking solutions that we're picking them for the right reasons. I have a policy for that, documentation that doesn't fit the bill, so we're looking at documentation from a point of view that there is context to it. You know, we need to make sure it's not documentation we're implementing because X company over there or competitor over there has got. It needs to be right for our organisation. And then running before we can walk. Adherence to these standards can be time consuming. It can be a huge change for business and for the business people, but also it might not be the right thing for your organisation to adopt if it doesn't fit right with the culture. And these frameworks only really work when the people are embedded in that culture. So it's important that we look at the frameworks and we look at where we can essentially take the elements that we need, or if we're going to adhere to a framework that has certification attached to it, is it the right certification for our organisation? So let's look at purple lights first of all. And the reason I use the purple lights phrase is our new cyber director is an American, and he said to me it was a phrase that they used in the States where a device or an appliance would have a purple light on it to make it look really cool. Over and above the average green hard disk light or the blue light, it was a purple light because it was the cool kid in the server rack, shall we say. But the key bit for me is don't go to that vendor who has the purple light, who has the shiniest tool in the box. The solution must be resolving or reducing a risk significantly enough to warrant that investment. If you're buying it because someone said it's great, if you're buying it because a competitor has it, they're valid reasons, but they're probably not the most efficient reasons to be buying or trying a solution. So make sure it's actually reducing a significant number of risks to warrant the investment, and make sure it's not introducing more risks than it solves. That's the key element. Don't assume it will solve all the problems either. That's another point that is well made, and I've seen a number of organisations buy a solution or buy a product, assume it's going to be the silver bullet to their problems, and it turns out it's a bit of a wet fish, excuse the pun, but it doesn't really do the job, becomes a bit of a paperweight, and people are expected to pick up, making it work without having any sort of formal training. And this leads nicely onto my third point of expecting IT to implement a tool or implement a product or solution without any training whatsoever. Just because it's technical, there's this assumption that they can make everything go and they're wizards. I've been in that situation myself. I had an MD that would like to throw things out and then say, yeah, we're definitely going to do this because this is the right thing to do. We could do this for our customers, make it work. And you had 3 days to do it. Doesn't work. It really doesn't work. And you don't see the return on investment for a lot longer without having the correct training on it. So just make sure that whatever we're implementing, there is a sufficient training program in place for our people to understand the product. Policy. So policies generally tend to have a negative connotation to them. They tend to be dull, dry, boring, etc. We do need them. They are a foundation, but it's important that we don't create policies for policy's sake, because it's very unlikely they're going to have the impact that we think they might have. And just because X competitor or Y company over there has it, do we need it? And it should always be context driven. And remember, that policy is your high level statement of intent. It's nothing more than that, but it does give people an idea, if they read the policy, what your intentions are. So make sure the policy is fit for you. Do not assume that a policy will be read. And this is key because so many policies don't get read. So many policies are just left as a stack of paper or electronic paper, and people really aren't enacting on it. And that's because we haven't embedded the culture. We haven't embedded the policy sufficiently for people to really grasp the ramifications of not following said policy. So it's critical that the people are involved from the start, and the people are the key area that we need to focus on. The policy's great. It sets that foundation. But if it's not got a security focused or a security led culture behind it, it will not have the impact that you think it's going to have. So make sure that we don't create policies or too many policies for people to read. And then the final bit, don't expect to be compliant because you've got policies. I've been to organisations where they have 50, 60 policies and they say, yep, definitely we're going to go for this, and you do the assessment with them and it turns out the policies aren't really being enacted and the policies aren't really effective, and therefore they don't get anywhere near where they need to be for compliance. It's not a management tool. Policies aren't there for a management tool. Policies are there to help you build that foundation and build that security defence piece. But don't assume that compliance will come swiftly afterwards. It just doesn't happen. Then our final point, don't run, walk. Maturity takes time. And I know this frustrates some people because people want things just to happen. But it's important that your framework that you choose is something that's appropriate for your organisation, and you can use your organisation's language to push that framework and to get people to change their business as usual practices. So choose one that's achievable for you, not one that because the industry says this is the best thing since sliced bread. Don't accept unrealistic implementation times. Another key bit, I see a lot of people in our industry have got very short implementation times, and if it's done right, yes, one can get a set of framework in place, can get the right documentation in place, but the implementation doesn't stop at the point when you've got documentation in the framework. The implementation really starts when you start to get people involved, you start to train people, you start to work with people and say, right, we need to change this business practice. If someone says they can get you to compliance in 3 to 5 days, they're leading you to the tick box, and that's really not what the framework should be doing. It shouldn't be about just tick boxing it. And then the final point, don't expect the users to be excited or ready for change. And that's coming from experience when I've been in organisations that want to do an assessment or a gap analysis, and you go and interview individuals and you ask them if they're a 27001 compliant house, and you say, where's your information security policy, or where's this, do you know about this? And they're sort of, no, not really, I don't really know about that, or I could probably take a guess, or I think we had some training. There's not as much as excitement from the infosec space as there is in, say, the HR or the finance space. They're very much in their little world, and it's important to recognise and face it head on that change is going to be a time-consuming effort. We need to have a degree of patience with people, and we need to make sure our communication is from the top down. If top-level management are seen as embracing that change, embracing that framework, the lower levels will automatically see that it's being done from the top, so therefore we should follow suit. The moment that top-level bit's missing, most of the time the lower levels don't really see the reason why. So we need to make sure that's really coming down from that top level. how do we begin our journey to a better world? Well, first of all, we need to know our assets. We need to consider our assets far further afield than the usual suspects that we think about, like the laptop in front of me or the phone that I'm talking into and its camera. And I think more often than not, people forget that your people, your employees, they are assets, and those people are just as important as the technology that we love to use every day. So we need to make sure we consider people as assets. We also need to consider our facilities, so our office space. I know we're probably not in our office space as much as we used to be. Some people are going, some people aren't. We need to consider our data centres. They are a facility and an asset. And we need to consider our tech. So let's think about our assets, and let's make sure all of our assets are assigned an owner. And this is usually at a role level. It's not really at an individual level, but we want to make sure that people are aware they own that asset. So therefore, do they know their responsibility? Let's value the asset. Let's put a value to it. How critical is it to the organisation that this asset is running, it's secured, it's maintained? And some assets will have a greater criticality because they impact business as usual operations than, say, other assets which may only affect a single user. So we need to make sure we value those assets accordingly. Then we need to identify threats and vulnerabilities to those assets. So what things could happen when those assets are either attacked, whether they're lost, stolen, set on fire, whatever it might be. We need to look at those threats and vulnerabilities and understand what could happen. And then we look at appropriate controls. So tied in with this, we will talk about risk assessment shortly, but we look at the appropriate controls that we might need to implement to protect those assets better. And again, includes our people. We need to make sure we are people focused and we know that our people are an asset, and therefore how do we protect them as well as protecting the technology and protecting those processes that they use. So from a framework perspective, we've got the three major frameworks that I've worked with, 27001, NIST and PCI DSS, and they've all got their respective elements around assets and what they're expecting of an organisation to do. So it's a good start to use one of these. Again, make sure it's the framework for you. NIST might be too far beyond a lot of organisations, and I personally feel that is the case. But certainly people dealing with cardholder data, PCI DSS is the de facto, it is the one. But you can incorporate that into 27001 as well. So it's just making sure that that framework is right for you and this is the right way to do it. Let's have a look at that risk approach then. So we talked about people, we talked about how do people interact with assets that have been identified. We want to know how our people can affect the security of those assets and how can we protect those assets from those threats and vulnerabilities we've identified. We look at our technology. How does our technology interact with the assets? We talk about technology with people and people with technology. And then we look at how people use that technology, and in using that technology, are they going to affect those assets and the security of those assets? So our data, for example, is an asset. They're using laptops at home at the moment. Everyone's using a lot of home technology that may not have the security standards that your office technology once had. So we need to be careful of that and we need to be mindful of that. And then we look at how can we use technology. So this is where we do bring the vendors and the product solutions peoples in to say, I've got this issue, this is my risk, I need to reduce this risk, I'm looking for a product that can help with that. And then finally we look at processes. Processes are a key way to keep standard operations running smoothly. So we need to look at our processes from a point of view, how does that process interact with the asset? How does it interact with data? How does it interact with people? Who's needed to make that process go? And then we look at how does that process affect security? Does it require us to put in additional controls because that process exposes something in particular? And then we look at how can we develop protection for those processes? How can we make sure that the threats and vulnerabilities that we have identified are accurately addressed by that process, shall we say? So let's look at risk. Risk is one of those areas people get really turned off by. It's got a muddled reputation depending on who you talk to, but it can be really simple. It can be really straightforward. It doesn't need to be complex. But the key elements for risk are that every risk has an assigned owner, so that person knows they're responsible for that risk. We then need to make sure our risk plans are in place. So we've got our risks, we know then how to address the risks, and that's where we start to pick controls from frameworks and we start to implement solutions and tools and products to build up that defence. And then we want to make sure that plan is approved by that risk owner. They need to be aware of what we're doing. And top level management also need to be aware of that implementation and make sure that they know what's going on. Looking back at our frameworks again, each framework has a section on the risk planning and the risk treatment plan, as they like to call it in ISO world. So yeah, looking at your frameworks, all of them have a section in there around creating plans to make sure that your risk analysis is used to the benefit of the organisation, to reduce those risks, to have something in place to build that cyber defence and protect those assets. And then the final point I want to talk about is how do we respond when things don't go right? And I think this is fundamentally just as important as implementing products and solutions. We need to have a plan when things don't go right. So through our risk assessment, through our asset identification, we can then create incident response plans for those critical assets where we feel we need to have some answer to if this asset were to fail tomorrow, we've got a way to deal with it. Then our incident response plan should have all the responsibilities of all the individuals that are involved. Make sure people are aware they're responsible. I've seen incident plans where it's got names, it may have roles and titles in it, and people aren't even aware that they're responsible for that piece. So it's really important that education piece is there. And that leads nicely onto this point of making sure employees are aware of the plans. Make sure they know how to respond to incidents. And even those people that aren't in the plan directly are still aware of it. They still know how to do something if something goes wrong. So let's look at how we would develop that plan. So we've got our preparation, we've done our risks, we've done our identification of assets. We're now preparing for those plans to be put together. Then we need a way to detect. We need a way to say, or if we see a problem, how do we report it? And it's important that people have as many channels as possible to report incidents. And that could be through web, that could be through phone, could be through an app, it could be through email. It can be a multitude of avenues, say, but we want to make sure that there are sufficient ways to communicate if something is discovered. Because the quicker we know about it, the quicker we can respond. And then we look at containment and we look at how do we essentially analyse that problem, how do we determine it's a genuine security incident, and then how do we respond? Do we need to contain something? Do we need to isolate something in order to then remediate, shall we say? And then the final bit, which I think is really, really key, is all around reviewing that incident process at the end and saying after the disaster or after the major incident, whatever it might be, we look at that plan and we say, did the plan go accordingly? Did it work? Were there steps that, okay, they worked, but we could be more efficient in? Or were there steps that just didn't work and we didn't get to the answer quick enough? And it's really key, and I think there's a lot of people do forget that this is definitely one of the strongest parts of having incident response, business continuity, disaster recovery, is reviewing those steps. And that's why we encourage people to train and we encourage people to do desktop exercises and scenario-based training so that they can test that these plans work. Because it's really, really good that you've got a plan, but if you don't test that it works and you don't test it, you've got no idea whether it's going to work or whether it's going to be efficient enough. And you're going to be able to respond quick enough to whatever the incident might be. Let's have a quick whiz through that, building that plan. We've got our responsibilities, we've got our management responsibilities, our procedures should all be described and people should know what they're responsible for. We want as many ways to report incidents. Don't want to give users any sort of hurdle to jump in order to report a security weakness or report a security inefficiency. We then need the right people on the job. We need them to make the decision and to ensure that all incidents are determined to be genuine security incidents. And then we need to have a response. We need to have actions. We need to have that bit of the plan that says, right, in this scenario, once it's been determined it's genuine, this is the action and this is the response we are going to make. And then finally, learning from that incident. Sit down, round the table, work out what worked, what didn't work, and revise the plan. It's all continuous improvement. It's not going to be perfect first time, so don't ever expect it to be, but just ensure that you're doing that review piece. So, in summary, know your assets so you can determine what needs protecting. Without that knowledge, it's very difficult to build any sort of cyber defence. Know your risks to your assets so you can choose appropriate controls and frameworks to allow and follow. and then know how to react when things don't go according to plan. It's really key that we've got that in place at the same time as we start to build our defences, so that we can understand, okay, now we know what we're looking at, we know what we're looking for, we've got an idea for our risk assessment of what kind of threats and vulnerabilities we're going to encounter, and we've established our assets, and now we need to have a response when things don't go right. And this is why we titled this talk, It's Not If, It's When, because it is going to happen. It's just when is it going to happen, nobody can tell. But as long as you've got these 3 basic building blocks in for that cyber defence, and they're maturing all the time, you're continuously improving on those processes, it should be a case of you can respond quickly, accurately and efficiently, and essentially eliminate that issue before it becomes bigger than it should be. So, I want to thank you for your time. Really appreciate you coming today, and look forward to meeting you soon. All the best.